Some people pronounce it Anthropocene. I pronounce it Anthropocene. The era or epoch in the history of the Earth in which humankind has exercised a dominant influence over the global environment and, in some definitions, has shaped the fundamental biogeochemical cycles that operate on the Earth. The idea of an Anthropocene has its precursors. The Comte de Buffon in the 18th century, for example, had already begun to think about an age of the Earth in which human beings exercise sufficient influence so as to create something that might be called a second nature, on top of, in addition to, and perhaps in some respects in places replacing the original nature. And in the 19th century, there was an Italian polymath, a priest, a revolutionary, a geologist named Antonio Stoppani, who worked at the University of Milan, who wrote a book, Corso di Geologia, it's called, and in that book he introduced a term which he called the Anthropozoico, or the Anthropozoic era. And he was then consciously thinking of an era in the history of life on Earth in which human beings were a crucial, perhaps governing force in the history of life. And he published that in the 1870s. So the concept of the Anthropocene has some important deep precursors in European thought, and perhaps in thought in other parts of the world, although I haven't seen any evidence of that anyone has yet uncovered. The more direct precursor is probably the Russian geochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, who introduced ideas such as the noosphere in the early 20th century, which has some similarities to the concept of an Anthropocene. The precise term Anthropocene first surfaced in 1958 according to Google Ngram Viewer, which allows you to trace the frequency of use of any word or a combination of words in the English language. But it didn't last. By 1962, the term Anthropocene had gone extinct. And then it was resurrected, perhaps invented a second time, by two important scientists, Eugene Sturmer and Paul Crutzen. And Crutzen is most famously associated with the idea of the Anthropocene nowadays because he has continued to use the term, to promote the term, and Sturmer is no longer in the land of the living, so he can't do that. So Paul Crutzen is often seen as the father of the term and even the idea of the Anthropocene, although he himself candidly admits that he's not the only one to have developed this concept and term. One of the interesting problems with the concept of the Anthropocene is nobody can agree when it began. People may think we're in it or we're headed for it, but there's at least 6, maybe more, rival visions of when the Anthropocene began. So a lot of people, and I have said this sometimes myself, maintain that the Anthropocene began in the middle of the 20th century. Scale, scope, pace of human intervention in the global environment took off in such a way that while humans influenced the environment before, what happened after 1945 or 1950 was a different order of magnitude. And so that's when we should say the Anthropocene began. And some people, geologists in particular, and I'll return to this point in a bit, like the idea of 1945 because there's a signal, a trace in the radiation fallout from nuclear testing beginning in July of 1945. And that could be the sort of geological signal that indicates the onset of the Anthropocene. So that's one idea, mid-20th century. Another idea, and one that Crutzen himself has consistently favored, is the advent of intensive use of fossil fuels around the turn of the 19th century, 1800, maybe 1820. Of course, fossil fuels, coal and others, were used before that, but they weren't used in such volumes as to begin to affect the global sulfur cycle and to begin to affect the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere, and through that, climate on Earth. So from Crutzen point of view, and many people agree with him on this, the Industrial Revolution is really the beginning of the Anthropocene. Those are the two modern Anthropocene visions. However, there are people who think that we should conceive of the Anthropocene as having more ancient beginnings. So there are a couple of Italian soil scientists who say the Anthropocene began 2,000 years ago because we can see at that point the widespread appearance of so-called anthropogenic soils that show some indication of human manipulation, human improvement, perhaps. Then there is the view associated with William Rudiman, an environmental scientist from the University of Virginia, who maintains that human beings began to influence climate by 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, maybe even a little earlier, because of the earliest clearings for agriculture, woodland clearings, and after that, the use of wet rice in East and Southeast Asia, which puts more methane into the atmosphere. And the combination of more CO2 from woodland clearance and more methane from rice paddy cultivation, according to Rudiman, affected the chemical composition of the atmosphere sufficiently to change the pattern of climate on Earth as early as 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. And there are even earlier ones. Some people, not too many, paleoecologists, maintain that with the late Pleistocene extinctions, 20,000 to 12,000 years ago, mainly in North and South America, the ratio of grassland to forest land changed in ways that in turn affected the chemical composition of the atmosphere and in turn affected climate. So there's a few voices that say the Anthropocene is even older than the Holocene. It actually dates from the late Pleistocene. So there are some of the rival visions of when the Anthropocene might have begun. So any concept that has disagreements that range over several millennia about when it began is a controversial concept. The Anthropocene is controversial in a couple of other respects too. There is the moral and political critique that some people offer that runs like this. The whole term and concept seem to imply that it's the human species as a whole that is responsible for the tremendous impacts and disruptions on the climate system and the Earth system generally, and that is misleading because some people have much more influence than others, and the term Anthropocene generalizes responsibility, which should be distributed much more specifically and precisely. So that's a moral and political critique of the term and concept. And then lastly, there is the geological or geologist's critique, which runs like this. Periods in Earth history have to have precise, demonstrable markers in the Earth itself, sometimes called these golden spikes. And if geologists can't find one that's going to be durable for not just centuries and thousands of years, but millions of years, if we don't have that, how can we demarcate, how can we even recognize an Anthropocene? Geologists feel that it is up to them. They are sovereign over the periodization of the history of the Earth. Little do they know that is actually not up to them, that historians and journalists and others are going to be using the term Anthropocene whether the geologists like it or not. That's the way culture works.